Hello, today we're reading a book called The Listeners by Jordan Tannehill. This follows a woman who one day starts hearing this unrelenting humming noise, and in her desperation to get the people around her to believe that it's real, and also to find the source of it, and stop it, her life completely unravels. I am about 120 pages into this almost 300-page book, and I'm here to give you a summary of what's happened so far and my thoughts. So it starts by introducing us to our narrator, Claire. She is telling this story in retrospect, and we know that it ends with some massive incident on Sequoia Crescent, where she screams at a bunch of news cameras naked, which she says turned into a viral meme. She says, "You've probably seen the GIF." It is a strong start. It's like just a little bit unnecessarily dating itself. I don't really know why it has to be a viral GIF, why she has to use the word meme within like 3 sentences, and I'm sure there won't really be a reason, but it is actually a strong start in that that is a wild hook, and I absolutely do want to know what happens to get us there. Anytime the book gets boring, which for all its faults so far hasn't really happened yet, I can think back to wanting to know how it ends the way it does. It's like a perfect little sprinkling of crumbs with the ending. It's enough to maintain my interest and curiosity, but not too much that I feel like the best and biggest parts have been spoiled for me. So as you might have been able to tell from the "you've probably seen this GIF of me," Claire has an interesting voice. A voice that I am flip-flopping between absolutely hating and loving hating. She is certainly meant to be insufferable in a lot of ways, but there are other quirks that I think, though I'm not totally sure, I'm meant to see as like more positively, and I am just unable to accept them like that. With the intentional insufferability, she has this like air of superiority that is similar to what you see with the wealthy, but hers comes from the opposite. She thinks she's better than other people because she grew up without money and she doesn't care about luxury. She says that she was a riot girl in college who dreamed of being even more poor, of being glamorously poor. But then her and her now husband Paul got pregnant at 21 and ended up doing pretty well for themselves, her as a high school English teacher and him owning a construction business. They live pretty average domestic suburban lives with their 17-year-old daughter Ashley. But Claire has never really let go of that feeling of being better than other people despite her change in circumstances, so she comes across as a pompous, patronizing snob. She is very assured in her opinions and beliefs, and she looks down on others who don't perfectly align with her worldview because hers must be the most righteous and just way of thinking. She's a feminist. Did you know she's a feminist? Don't let me get ahead of myself with that. We'll get to the feminism. In being so self-assured, Claire doesn't really care what other people think in that like boss babe, take the power back kind of way. It's not the liberation of her not caring what other people think of her though. It's her not caring what anyone thinks at all, period, which just makes her really unlikable. Again, to be clear, this is all deliberate. We're not supposed to be fully on her side at any point in this story. We can see all these characteristics displayed in the opening scene. It's an argument between her and her husband, Paul. They had had dinner with friends that night, and now, in private, together in bed, Paul is expressing feeling troubled that Claire had spoken for both of them and declared to their friends that they were atheists. He says, "Actually, I lean more religious. I lean towards faith, and if I wasn't married to you, I would probably be going to church." Claire is taken aback. She has spent years deprogramming the Catholicism out of her husband, and I mean, she has decided that they're atheists, and that should be enough. She decided that she was an atheist when she was in high school, and she realized that God is just like every other boy in her school, which is maybe an inoffensive, innocuous thing to say in isolation, but just like hold on to that little quip for me, okay? So in this moment of confession and vulnerability where Paul says that being back in church a few months ago for his father's funeral had comforted him and reignited his faith, Claire thinks, he's testing me. This is bait. But then she also thinks, what is that noise? There's this very, very low, deep humming. It's just on the threshold of her perception as they're having this conversation that ends in like some light ribbing and the declaration that he can go to church all he wants, but she doesn't want anything to do with it. She's having trouble focusing on the conversation, continuously bringing it back to the noise, which no matter how hard Paul tries, he can't hear. And that, of course, because he can't hear, he doesn't really care about. Claire, however, unlike how she usually is, which she describes as unconcerned, but looks more like self-centered and uncaring, does care. She cannot let this noise go. She spends hours wandering their house trying to figure out the source deep into the night. Whenever she thinks that she's found the direction that it's coming from, and she is certain it's coming from outside her body, she moves towards it and then it changes direction. When she finally tries to go to sleep, She can't. She tries earplugs, they don't help. At like 4 or 5 in the morning, she gets out of bed and she wanders outside trying to see if her neighbors have like a new pool pump or something, kind of aimlessly though. As she's standing in the middle of the road, barefoot in her nightgown, watching a coyote slink behind a tree, Paul surprises her from behind. He is in a panic, having woken up to the power out because she flipped the breaker, her not in bed, and the door wide open. Paul goes through a very believable series of emotions where fear turns to anger, turns to relief, turns to worry. There's this kind of funny moment here where he's like, "You're still on about the hum? Why didn't you just put earplugs in?" And she pulls earplugs out of her pocket and throws them to the ground. And then not 3 lines later, she says, "My hands are shaking. I wish I had pockets to shove them into." So where did the earplugs come from? I know I keep alluding to this feminism thing that I'm not going to expand on until later, but I'm kind of surprised that this didn't go, ugh, I wish I had pockets big enough to fit my hands into. Women's clothing, am I right? During this fight with Paul in the middle of the street, she realizes that she can feel the hum physically vibrating every cell in her body, and her nose starts bleeding. And she's like, "Do you believe me now?" Showing him the blood. And he's like, "Are you trying to say that the noise you're hearing has given you a nosebleed?" Like, no, this does not convince me. She tears into him with, "You should just believe me because I'm telling you it's the truth, and if I say it, you should believe it." And he finally relents, though she can tell he doesn't really believe that the hum has a source outside of her head. He has finally, though, moved into the worry stage, the worry and concern. He's now wrapping his arms around her and bringing her back home, where she doesn't sleep at all. In the morning, she goes for a run, even though she used to think that joggers were the lowest form of life. She now is one. Is this meant to be funny? Am I meant to be laughing at her? Should I be laughing with her? I don't know. There are many moments where I think her disdain for other people is maybe supposed to be relatable and humorous, but it just reads as like, okay, great, you're better than everyone else. I get it. I think the author is a little bit confused with the direction of this character. Her insufferable qualities will sometimes come across as intended to be insufferable, and then those same qualities will sometimes come across as intended to be funny, and it makes hating her a little bit less fun because I'm like trying to parse through what I am meant to be hating. On her run, she stumbles across some construction workers who are putting up a new cell tower, which is described as a utility pole, and I'm pretty certain that those are 2 distinct things. She describes a utility pole and says it's a cell tower. I don't know. What do I know? I have no idea if that's true or not. I tried to look it up and it seems like I'm right, but I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong. She stops to look at what's going on and one of her neighbors comes to talk to her and she asks the neighbor if she hears the hum. And of course, the neighbor says no. Over the next few weeks, she asks all of her neighbors if they hear the hum and no one does. She's getting almost no sleep, at best 3 hours a night, and she is falling apart, which is hard to do if you're a high school English teacher with 30 eyes on you all day, especially in the school where your daughter is a student. People notice, rumors spread, and at one point she sort of freaks out in front of one of her classes, all haggard and red-eyed. She asks them if they can hear the hum too. She then takes a couple of weeks, which turns into 2 months off of work after this incident at her daughter's pleas. She spends this time obsessing, falling further into herself, and spiraling. She's on message boards and forums and researching all types of other similar stories. She knows everything about noise pollution and human auditory perception and what this could possibly be caused by. Paul is very worried about her. He's making her go to doctor's appointments and audiologists who all just end up sending her to psychiatrists. Once this 2-month leave is up, she can't afford to quit her job, which I do wish it expanded on a little bit more because our introduction to her is her telling us that as a couple, her and Paul have way more money than either of them are used to or need, that their house is like filled with stuff and that's so unfamiliar to her that she's always breaking the stuff in the house. It's a small inconsistency, but it's really noticeable to me because it was truly my first impression of Claire that she had more money than she needed. And it feels very easy to write out that plot hole. Like she could have just said that they couldn't have afforded their mortgage or Ashley's post-secondary without her income. But anyway, small nitpick aside, back at school, she's decided to pretend like she no longer hears the noise. She says that her life is back on track. Her coworker friends are treating her like she's functioning and well. Her daughter is no longer avoiding her in the hallways. Everything is okay on the outside. One day, a student comes to her classroom to talk with her about an upcoming assignment. He has been slacking off in class and falling asleep and listening to his headphones, but he's one of those classic kids, especially boys that you always hear about in fiction, who doesn't apply himself, but a layer below his cool, indifferent exterior is a brilliant mind that just needs a hip with the kid's young mom teacher to pull it out of him and allow him to meet his potential. They talk about this essay that he hasn't started working on but is planning to do about a massive, complex tome instead of the recommended of Mice and Men, and then Claire looks at him a little closer and realizes he's more than just teenage boy sleep deprived. and she asks him if he's okay. And he tells her that he can't sleep because of the hum. That ever since she brought it up in class, he realized that he could hear it too, and it has been destroying his life in the same way it has hers. Hearing this is like almost an out-of-body experience for her. She had completely given up on ever being believed, let alone understood. He tries in this moment to mimic the sound, but it's far too low for any human voice to copy. She says that she's touched by his willingness to try. Immediately, any pretense of professionalism is thrown out the window, and they become confidants in this very inappropriately emotionally intimate relationship. A relationship that has been telegraphed like a flashing billboard. When he first comes into the room, he leaves the door open, and she thinks, that's school policy. No student and teacher can be alone in a room with a closed door together. Though it is shoved in there very clunkily, I don't have too much of a problem with that. I think that it can be okay to let your readers know what they're in for like this with very heavy topics, even if that might mean sacrificing subtlety and grace. And in a way, it also makes it feel a little bit less shock factory. I bring it up just to say that when this happens, it comes as no surprise to anyone. There is, however, something that I don't really like here, which is where she says, fast forward 2 weeks right after her heart-to-heart with Kyle. Did I say that his name is Kyle? Have I already said that? Take that as you will. His name is Kyle. So it fast forwards 2 weeks to her sneakily picking him up at a park near the school and then taking him on a drive. And then it goes straight into telling us what the last 2 weeks have consisted of. I don't understand what the point is of fast forwarding 2 weeks, especially saying fast forward 2 weeks, if you're gonna just go straight back into those 2 weeks. I was thinking that this was fast forwarding to their first meetup and just skipping the planning and going straight to the kind of illicit behavior, which, to be clear, the relationship is extremely inappropriate and abusive, but where I'm at right now, it is not yet physical. But it isn't going to that first meeting. They have met up many times over the last 2 weeks. You'd think that there would be a lot of emotions around that first time that they get together after school in secret, but we skip it entirely. They have been meeting up and mapping out the neighborhood and recording possible sources of the noise. The noise that they hear is at I think like 10 to 20 hertz, which should be below most people's perception, where all the noises that they record from like factories on the outskirts of the suburb or whatever are at like 50 hertz. They're doing some pretty intensive research and they are getting nowhere, and they're also becoming attached to each other. This is a very brief section of this story, as most are because the pacing is insanely fast in this book, but we do only see this attachment from Claire's side. Of course, he's taking a lot of comfort in her as the one other person experiencing the same thing, but also as an authority figure who is trying to help him fix this thing that's ruining his life. She is taking comfort in him, the 17-year-old boy, as a peer. And when he calls her in the middle of the night to tell her that there are other people in the neighborhood who also hear the hum, she feels betrayed. Not, like you would have expected a couple of weeks earlier, excited or relieved or anticipatory. He's telling her, whispering into her ear over a midnight phone call she takes in the kitchen, that they are planning a meeting 2 weeks from now, that there's enough people who hear this hum to organize a meeting. And yet all she can think about is that this was supposed to be their thing. That hunting this down together, just the two of them, had given her a new lease of life, and now there are more people to come between them. Kyle says he found this out because he mentioned the hum to a friend that he plays soccer with, and that friend said that his mom heard it too, so Kyle went to speak to her. This isn't about some us for Kyle. This is about the hum. But all Claire can ask is, did you tell them about us? Did you tell them about us? She hangs up, devastated, and turns around to find her daughter Ashley standing in the kitchen behind her, having heard the entire conversation. Ashley can see, as anyone would be able to, that something very inappropriate is going on here. At first, she thinks that her mom is just having like a simple affair, but when Claire explains it to her, she is sickened. Even though she believes Claire's assertions that this is not physical or sexual, Ashley knows that it is very, very wrong and has gone too far. Claire describes it to her as, what we have is special. He's my confidant and I'm his. And Ashley is like, this needs to stop. Claire begs her not to tell Paul, and Ashley, this child who has been Claire's close friend for the last 17 years, says, you have no right to ask me that. This is your choice. If you stop this, it will all go away. But you need to decide to stop. Claire goes into school the next morning with all the intentions of pulling Kyle aside and telling him that they can't keep meeting up. Except Kyle is not at school that day until lunchtime, when he is dragged into her classroom by the principal and his mother, who both know everything. Ashley had texted Kyle that morning telling him to stop seeing her mom, and his mom saw the text and made him explain it all. The two of them, but mostly Claire, try to explain everything to the principal and his mother, but of course, they look insane. They look unhinged. They can't communicate the significance of the hum or of finding someone else experiencing it. They can't convince the adults in the room that this relationship was okay because it wasn't. Regardless of how far it went, her emotional attachment to him is clearly beyond inappropriate. She is fired on the spot. And she resolves not to let Kyle's bitch mom, who of course Claire looks down on as being unintelligent, as if that's the important thing here, a woman trying to protect her son from, to the best of her knowledge, a predator. She swears she won't let this woman ruin Kyle by denying his experience of the hum. Claire's life is destroyed. Her marriage is in shambles, her daughter won't speak to her, and the hum persists. 2 weeks later, knowing that Kyle is going to be there and that they absolutely should not be interacting, she goes to that meeting. Now, there are a lot of people at this meeting, and it is a little bit confusing because they mostly all have very average nondescript names, so I might over-explain a little who everyone is as we talk about them, because I know most of you are watching this in the background as you do your dishes or whatever, and I respect that, and I want you to be able to follow along. So the hosts of this meeting are Howard, a geophysicist who studies atmospheric noise, and his grad student come much younger wife, Joe. Of course, Kyle is also there. There's Nora as well, the mother of Kyle's soccer friend. There is Leslie, a real estate agent. There's Seema, a younger college-age woman with a nose ring. And then there's Damien, an ex-military Redditor who Claire gets a toxic masculinity vibe from. There's also an elderly couple who shows up a little bit late, Tom and Emily. Tom is very much like a patriarchal, controlling, condescending partner to his cowed wife. When Claire first shows up to the meeting, she starts narrating about how she gets gassy when she's nervous, so she rips a giant fart and then has to wait for it to clear before she knocks on the door. And it was at this point that I became convinced that I am meant to be taking some of these things as funny. I think that was supposed to be funny. Her blunt crassness is, I have to believe, meant both to be funny and insufferably unbearable, but I just don't find it easy to laugh both with her and at her. There is not a very good balance being struck here. After she lets her fart waft away, she goes inside and she meets all of these people and she tries to make eye contact with Kyle, who's making a point to ignore her. While everyone has their little idiosyncrasies, there are just a couple too many of them to fully and totally distinguish. Like Emily, Joe, Nora, and Leslie, they are all different people, but they're either all similar in age or in Emily's case with a name that to me makes her seem younger than she is. So I am finding myself reading it, having to think back each time I see a name and figure out who it is. It's not a complete clusterfuck, but it is a little bit more effort than I want to have to put in. Not that I'm against putting effort in, I just am finding it distracting. So Howard opens the meeting full throttle saying, I'm a geophysicist, this is my field of study, and both Joe and I hear the hum, and it's because of lightning in the atmosphere. All of us are just very sensitive to it, and that's why we can hear it. He goes on for a minute, but it's not long before everyone says that that doesn't really sound right. It's not an atmospheric thing. This is something in their neighborhood. Tom, that old guy, says that he went to Phoenix recently and there was no hum, and he is here with the sole intention of getting together and going to the city council to get someone to investigate this. Howard keeps trying to steamroll the conversation. He's got an agenda. The college student with the nose ring, Seema, says, you need to be aware of how much space you're taking up, which, like, again, I get that there's meant to be some kind of feminism here, but this isn't how people speak to each other. This is just quips. This is more like a TikTok comment section than actual dialogue that you might expect in this extremely varied group of people who have literally just met each other 5 minutes ago. While everyone is arguing and going back and forth, Claire is thinking about all of the impressions that Kyle would do of these people, which I'm going to be generous and say that I think this is a good way of showing her delusion with Kyle. We haven't seen anything remotely like this from him. We have seen very little of his personality at all, and certainly not a tendency towards humor. If anything, he's come across as a very serious young man with a one-track mind. I think this is Claire mischaracterizing him, not a failure of the writing, and it's very sinister to see the difference between her perception of him and who he really is. How much she has romanticized this 17-year-old. Like, there's very much an intimacy to someone doing impressions like what Claire is imagining. There's like a secrecy, a you and me against the world dynamic, a sort of self-isolating where they look down on the world together and place themselves above and away from everyone else. I think it's very telling and very dark. So Howard and Joe are taking the side of this atmospheric noise argument where pretty much everyone else, but most strongly Seema and Tom the old man, are saying this is a local source. Part of this is a difference in opinion and part of it is acceptance. Howard started hearing the hum decades ago when he was in like the middle of his PhD research and has had more time to come to terms with it, where for everyone else, believing that there's something in their neighborhood that started it must mean that it can be stopped. So everyone except for Howard and Joe started hearing the hum 2 months ago. This annoys me because if we're trying to say that it started at the same time for everyone, which is what we're trying to say, that was at least 3 months ago. And I would actually say 3.5. Claire had 2 months of paid leave. That's where this 2 months ago number is coming from. She went back to work and then she had that talk with Kyle. Then, if you remember, it fast forwarded 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks after that fast forwarding is the meeting. And that timeline is not including the, I'm pretty sure, 2 weeks between the noise starting and her taking time off. If you've given me a timeline, you need to stick to your own timeline. You can't just keep saying everything's 2 weeks, everything's 2 months, and hoping that that will match up in the end. It doesn't. In this conversation, there is a dynamic where the men, logical, are solution-oriented, and the women, emotional, are looking for support and connection dealing with this difficult situation. Claire ends up opening up about how her life has fallen apart, and unexpectedly, she immediately starts crying as soon as she starts talking. And she says, I can't remember the last time I cried. Well, I can. It was 22 pages ago. As she's getting everything off her chest while the other women rub her shoulders, Tom, the old man who is dismissive of and rude to his wife, says, I think we should get back on track. And Claire is filled with rage, so much so that she can't even respond. Everyone else does tell him off for being a heartless dick, and then as they're trying to explain why people might be looking for comfort and how not everyone has a wife that understands them, Claire finally gets her voice back and she yells over everyone defending her and says, do not silence me, which just is not the powerful girl boss moment that I think it's trying to be. I'm sorry, that's so cringy to me. Why wouldn't she say literally anything else? It doesn't even make sense with the context. Again, it's just this quippiness. It's all the girl power here is just quips. They do manage to move on from this argument. Tom keeps threatening to leave, first because the women are too emotional, and then because Howard won't give up on this lightning in the atmosphere thing and won't hear any other explanations. Like, for example, the highway extension that went up at the same time they all started hearing the noise. There's a very charged tension in this room from the beginning. All of these people are desperate and worn down and unwell, and this feels like their last opportunity to do something about it. So they all want their voices heard, and none of them want to listen. Everyone is snapping at everyone else. It gets a little bit repetitive, actually. I think they overdo it beyond what feels realistic. And then Howard reveals that to him, the hum is a gift, and he starts talking about it with an almost religious devotion. How the hum, which he calls the resonance, with a capital R, has given his life new meaning, how he can harness its power. This religiosity is very interesting coming from the dude who is a literal scientist and keeps invoking the significance and trustworthiness of science. Everyone else, being basically disabled by this hum, is shocked by this, and no one can let his ramblings go on for very long, so we don't really know to what end Howard is taking this. He talks a little bit about how no one in his life heard it, including his wife and children, until he met Joe, who was studying under him, which, talk about foreshadowing, oh my god. At one point, Damien, the Redditor, is mostly quiet until he pipes up to say that he wants to find the group of people who have done this and kill them. And nobody is so that's insane. They're all interrupting each other for ages and ages until Tom gets so pissed off that he leaves. And his wife, Emily, stands up to him and she says, I'm staying. And he's like, no, you're coming with me. And she puts her foot down. Girl boss. That moment actually is fine. I'm sorry. I'm picking on everything. I have complaints. I'll make them later. Tom scoffs. He leaves without her, and then he comes back a second later to say there's a guy looking agitated sitting in a white car in the driveway. And Claire's stomach drops, and then her phone starts to ring. Even though violence has never entered their relationship before, everyone can see Claire's fear and the anger in Paul's pounding on the door, and they all jump to protect her. Paul, who was this gentle giant, ends up getting into a physical confrontation with Howard, who is 20 years his senior, when he refuses to let Paul into the house to get Claire. And it is pretty tense here, just to hear what's happening between them down the hall, and then suddenly there's a bang on the window of the room that they're in, and Paul is there saying, I can see you in there with him. And then Howard comes over to him, and he fully takes Howard down to the ground and then gets inside the house, and he says, we're going, and she refuses. And he tells her, if you don't come with me right now, our marriage is over, and she stays. And then he just walks away. And that is where we're at. That is the chapter where I have finished. We have had so very little of Paul and Claire's relationship that this doesn't really feel like much. I mean, it's obviously really significant. I just don't really feel anything about this. I do understand, though, how Paul has fallen to the side in her life, and so, of course, he would in the narrative as well. And I don't even necessarily feel like I want to know Paul better before this. It was made pretty clear how absurdly out of character this was for him, and that is part of why it's so frightening. I think I just maybe wanted just one more scene of the collapse of their relationship. Something about how it's been in the home in the time between her termination and this meeting. could have added something that feels like it's missing here. Although I do really like how this book is showing the different and rippling ways this hum is impacting people and their loved ones. You can read it straight or as an allegory for all kinds of more common things, disability, mental illness, addiction, whatever, but the impact on the interpersonal is very intriguing to me and very insightfully written, I think. Like I said, I am struggling a bit with the voice. She is a lot. There is this part near the beginning where she's talking about her and Paul's differences in parenting, and she says, "We both wanted to give Ashley things that we didn't have. Paul wanted her to have a neighborhood with parks and bike paths, and I gave her a vibrator for her 14th birthday." So that's weird. There might have been a way to make that not weird, but you just did not do it. Unless you've written this woman as like very open and sex positive and candid with her daughter about bodies and pleasure and stuff, that is just weird as fuck to me. Maybe I'm a prude. I can accept that. But this is certainly not the norm. And it makes me think that she is insufferable, but in an annoying way, which is not helped with this issue of the very inauthentic, shallow feminism that I have not been able to stop mentioning. There are all these little moments where Claire will say something like, "God is just like all the other boys," or "I don't like books about women moping," or "I didn't cast boys in the school play because girls are more capable," or like, "I'm drawn to women who take up space." And it's just such a corny attempt at engaging with feminist values that I cannot help but imagine the author, who is a man, sitting at his keyboard, tapping away, writing his female character, saying things like, "I was drawn to women who took up space." These are just like the worst parts of third wave feminism, right? Like, they're the quips, they're the BuzzFeedisms. It's taking the most inflammatory things that a feminist online might say and then just repeating them. There's no sense of like an actual ideology, and there's certainly no sense of a desire for change. There's no will to help anyone. It's just like the most nothing, boring, men are bad, women are good emptiness written by a man who I think kind of wants us to pat him on the back for it. And to be clear, I'm not saying that I wouldn't have the same problem if this was written by a woman. I have read women write feminism like this, and I hated it every time. But this is the issue with men writing women, or white people writing racialized characters, or straight people writing queer characters. You can do it. You absolutely can do it. No one is saying that you can't. But the reason that people are typically not that interested in your telling of these stories is because to write so far outside of your own experience, you actually have to put a lot of effort in to understand, and a lot of authors don't do that. And it's glaringly absent here. This is trying to be feminism without any understanding. It's little sarcastic quips with nothing behind them, and then a character who openly calls herself a feminist. That is just supremely cringy to me. Stop doing that, dude. Don't do that. Other notes I have, I think this book is absurdly fast-paced, maybe ridiculously so, but that's exactly what I need right now, so it is working for me. I have no idea what's going to happen, and I'm excited to find out, even though I am having some issues with it. I am feeling like with the introduction of this group, which, by the way, takes place on Sequoia Crescent, so you know it's going to be really important, that it's setting up this book to be more about what the source of the hum is, and I think that's not a very interesting direction to take this story. I don't really want it to be a mystery, and if the focus remains on their conspiracy theories like it is now and moves away from the interpersonal effects of this hum, then it's going to end up being disappointing if it doesn't reveal the source, and if it does, unless he somehow manages to make it very clever and unique and interesting, which I think will be really hard to do. Despite its problems, though, I'm having trouble putting this down, so I just want to go and read it, and I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to come back and tell you about it. I'll see you then. Hello, I'm here to give you an update on The Listeners by Jordan Tannehill. Last I left you, Paul had just left Claire, but he doesn't leave right away. They live in this awful tension, not speaking to each other for a few weeks before he finally moves out one day without saying anything to her. And it's not just Paul shutting her out. Ashley is too. So she is stuck in this situation where she doesn't have anyone at home to talk to, so she has to keep going to these meetings for someone to talk to, and her family will never take her back unless she stops going to the meetings. The Claire who is writing this after it's all gone down feels it very important to insist on her own agency in the situation. To repeat, though she knows that it makes the whole thing seem more suspicious, that she was not brainwashed, that she made her own choices and knew what she was doing. She reads her diaries from the time and she's shocked at her clarity, that they aren't just the ramblings of an unhinged madwoman that she expected. But then, of course, she goes immediately into talking about how the group allowed her to see that she shouldn't be seeking out medical help or psychiatry, that taking medication was dimming her sparkle. her sparkle being her heightened perceptive abilities. The narrative that the group made her a better or more elevated person persists through the story. It helps relieve her of her guilt for abandoning her family and justify her choice to continue going to the meetings, which she does with absolute wild abandon. They quickly push the number of meetings from once to twice to 5 times a week, and they become entirely extremely dependent on each other. It's at this time before Paul moves out where they're living together in these brutal, tense conditions, and Claire is falling deep into the group, where she notices that everyone around her is feeling the effects of the hum, whether or not they can hear it. Her newfound perceptive powers are allowing her to pick up on patterns that she would have otherwise brushed to the side. There's this general sense of disquiet and unrest that she sees in her neighborhood and on the news. During one of her many sleepless nights, she sees her next door neighbor swimming laps for hours underneath of his pool cover. I love that kind of shit. And I want more examples of this, but I do understand that for a lot of readers, those little moments do all serve the same purpose. And even with their uniqueness, which is what I love about something like swimming under the pool cover for hours in the middle of the night, they still kind of stall the story a little bit. I'm just greedy. I felt so unsettled by it. I really, really liked it. There isn't really any other examples of this weirdness or the coincidences that she keeps mentioning she can notice now. I think those could have added a little bit of intrigue at least. All she brings up is that she sees the same coyote from the beginning, and I'm only telling you that because I think that there's going to be something important with that coyote, because there is a lot of focus on the coyotes. Once Paul leaves, her and Ashley are still living together, but they've completely fallen apart. They avoid each other and they rarely talk until Ashley is rejected from her top 2 schools and she needs her mom. And because her mom is kind of just as childish as her, the actual child, when it comes to conflict between the two of them, it is Ashley's burden to extend an olive branch and seek out her mom to talk about it. Okay, in the beginning, before Claire takes time off of work, right after she asks her class if they can hear the hum as well, she doesn't know if Ashley is mad at her, and she's over analyzing how much Ashley is looking to the stands during her soccer game, and then she leaves the soccer game because she's it's obvious that she doesn't want me here because she's not looking over at me enough. Hello? And then after she leaves the soccer game, she starts avoiding her own daughter in the halls as a way to outwardly prove how hurt she is that Ashley might be upset at her and to not have to face any rejection, while still refusing to have a conversation with her daughter about how her daughter feels. Insanity. And I kind of love it as characterization. It made me hate Claire so much. She is so unbelievably childish and selfish in her parenting. Anyway, her and Ashley end up talking for hours, and Ashley manages to convince her to host the after prom party. Claire knows that she needs to say yes to this as her olive branch to Ashley. And what does it really matter anyway? It's not like she has a reputation to uphold anymore. We then cut to 3 weeks later with the two of them setting up party decorations. Claire, of course, is not allowed to be in the house during the party. She is a vibe harsher to the extreme beyond just being the mom or the adult in the room. So she's packing a bag to go spend the night at Leslie's. That is a woman from the group. That's the real estate agent. I think otherwise featureless. While they're getting ready, there's a knock at the door, and it isn't Ashley's ride to prom, which is what they expect. It is Tom and Seema, who Claire has not seen since the first meeting. The two of them broke off in the great schism of the hum perceivers. And they've been really gunning for city council to look into it, exactly what they wanted in that first meeting, and they've created a petition, they've gone canvassing, and they found some other people who can hear it, but no one who is willing to talk to the news about it. And they're here a little bit misguidedly to ask her to take her story to the media, and also to tell her that in taking their stories to the media, they're now being targeted, and Tom's mailbox was set on fire the night before. In this conversation with Tom and Seema, she clarifies her stance on the hum, the stance that she's developed through her almost daily meetings with the group, and she's finally clarifying it in a situation where she's able to face backlash, where she's not just talking to us, the silent reader. It's kind of scary because it isn't complete and total mad ramblings. She is calm and collected. The way she brings up her points is very practiced and coherent, and yet what she's saying is totally incoherent. It feels like a pretty accurate representation of indoctrination, and it is so frustrating to watch these 3 different approaches to getting through to her completely fail. Tom is frustrated and condescending, which of course doesn't work. Seema tries to understand and then tries to gently offer a different perspective. And Ashley, who had stormed off when she first saw the people from the group and is now sitting on the stairs listening in, attempts to appeal to emotion as Claire's daughter. But none of it works. Claire is so utterly convinced of all of her regurgitated talking points. She's certain of their scientific veracity. She voices this nonsense with a total clarity and confidence. It's honestly pretty frightening. She says that the hum has power, that she doesn't think that it can be stopped, and although it is still causing her the same physical suffering, she no longer wants it to be stopped. It's opening her mind to deeper states of consciousness. She even here parrots the idea that we only use 10% of our brains, and Seema tells her that is a common myth, but she plows right through it. And I think Tannehill knows that his audience is likely aware that that is a myth, and this is a pretty competent way of telling us that Claire is wrong, but I also at the same time think that his writing of this conspiratorial thinking and cult-like adoption of beliefs was good enough to stand on its own. Maybe the most upsetting part of this conversation is when Claire first sees Ashley sitting on the staircase listening, and instead of feeling shame or embarrassment like you expect her to feel at this point, even feeling like some sort of dread that overhearing all of this will put their relationship, which has hinged on the two of them not talking about the hum, back into the old dysfunctional state. You don't get any of that. No. She sees Ashley and listen to what happens. She thinks, good. I wanted her to hear what I was about to say. I turned back to Tom. Tom, the earth is making us aware of itself in the most extraordinary way, and you can choose to listen or you can choose not to, but I am listening because I have been given the gift of being able to, and so have you. What? The confidence in her narration as well, to be like, I want my daughter to hear this, and then spout that fucking nonsense. It's genuinely scary. Of course, no one listens to her, though. She can present this stuff as clearly and coherently as she wants, but it still is absolute nonsense, and it is obviously hurting her, and everyone can see that giving her an inch would be really harmful for her deteriorating state of mind. After this, there's a short chapter where Claire is kind of monologuing to herself about hysteria and how all women carry hysteria as a psychic wound inflicted by centuries of denial and discreditation, and it was here that I thought, oh, damn, Jordan Tannehill, I might have been totally wrong about you. I was not familiar with your game. I can admit when I'm wrong, and I think I was wrong. I'm not totally sure yet, but I've changed my mind almost all the way about that superficial feminism that I could not stop complaining about the first time I talked to you. Now, with this chapter, I think that all of that was deliberately annoying and surface level and stupid, because that is who Claire is. She's a privileged person who twists and skews a global movement into something that only exists for her benefit. She is weaponizing oppression to make herself more credible and justified, and also to feel better than other people, which we know from her earlier characterization is something that she loves doing. Even if I wasn't wrong, which I'm pretty certain I was, I want to believe that this is the case, because I think that's a big-brained move on the author's part. Also, just like generally with this book, I do think that Tannehill has given his audience morally gray situations told through his insufferable but coherent narrator in a way that forces you to make up your own mind about these things, and I believe that that extends to this. I think I was interpreting it in a little bit of bad faith before because it was genuinely hard to read the little feminist quips that she had, and I didn't know what we were doing with it. But now that I do, I've totally changed my mind. This takes skill, and I like it a lot. The next chapter, she gets home to a destroyed house, and she's like, where's my Georgia O'Keeffe painting? There is no way that that isn't a sarcastically written caricature. Are you kidding? Her house being destroyed and her Georgia O'Keeffe painting not being on the wall anymore is really the least of her problems here. Because not only is her ex-husband Paul in the driveway finally come to pick up his boxes of stuff that he's been ignoring her messages about for weeks, but so is Kyle. Kyle, who was not supposed to be invited to the party, a hard and clear boundary that they set beforehand, Kyle's here. And he's here helping Paul move his boxes out to his car. Kyle was kicked out of his mom's house because she found out that he was still going to the meetings, so Ashley, pitying him, invited him to sleep on their couch. Ashley had also planned with Paul for him to come over and pick up his stuff that morning, so Claire is certain that Ashley has conspired against her, and she doesn't hesitate to accuse her of it. Paul is obviously like, Kyle can't fucking stay here, he shouldn't even be near you, and Claire says that's inhumane, we can't kick him out on the street, so Paul goes to call Kyle's mom, while Claire tries to talk her way into having Kyle stay there. Kyle ends up leaving because it is so awkward in this house. Ashley also ends up leaving to move in with her dad in his one-bedroom apartment, and before she goes, she tells Claire, "You're in a cult." And this sticks with Claire hard. She, of course, doesn't think that she's in a cult. It doesn't get through to her at all. She's just really troubled that her daughter could think that about her. She tells us all the reasons that it isn't a cult, mainly being that there's no monetary gain for anyone involved. She also says that there's no hierarchy, but that just simply isn't true. Howard and Joe brought this group together. They host every meeting. They're also older, well, Howard is, and Howard is like a so-called expert in this field and the creator of these beliefs. So, like, there's that. That does feel a little bit hierarchical, to me at least. Claire is just trying to maintain some semblance of logic as a self-proclaimed logical person. But she is also aware enough to bring up some of the more concerning moments with the group in regards to their conspiratorial thinking. The 9/11 conspiracies, QAnon, the deep state, all of these things come up and cause heated arguments, but Claire's takeaway is that her ability to relate to and spend time with people with such different political opinions shows how much the group is a positive force in her life. And she demonstrates this by saying the most insane thing: the old me would have cut anti-vaxxers and truthers out of my life, like Kevin Spacey was cut from that Ridley Scott movie. What? What are you saying? I thought that was completely out of place and tactless as fuck. I am not socially intelligent enough to know if I meant to laugh at this or if it's an example of how terrible of a person Claire is, but either way, I thought it was kind of like a holy shit, why would you say that moment? Because it really isn't in character for her here at all, especially at this point in the book. Okay, so there are two new people in the group. There's Sean. He's a gay Jewish man who brings like a lightness to the meetings by joking around in a really affable, likable way. And then there's Mia, who is woke with a capital W and who introduced herself by saying her pronouns, which Claire feels is absurd in the context of this group, but she also says that she understands it, and Mia helps the group to be more careful and deliberate with their language and ideas. This definitely felt like a middle-aged gay man grappling with the queer kids and their newfangled pronouns, but not in an ill-intentioned way. More just in a, like, do you not have a diary kind of way. Like, with how meaningless this is in the grand scheme of things, I think you could have done it in your journal. Anyway, most of Claire's stories of the meetings are about them talking and theorizing. It does seem to me pretty well conceptualized in terms of what would likely happen in this kind of meeting, though it is just like a little bit repetitive writing-wise, but again, never enough that I lose interest. Then we get to the first time that the group tunes. This is almost similar to a guided meditation led by Joe, where they all focus in on the power of the hum until it starts growing so large and loud and all-consuming that it's both suffocating and orgasmic. It is something entirely different from an orgasm, and also it is just a group orgasm. Everyone is really excited about this revelation that they can utilize the hum in some positive way, and no one seems to mind the presence of the 17-year-old boy in the room. It's horrific, it's sickening, and I also think it's interesting characterization that all of these people together, all of these adults, are similarly unconcerned with the safety of this young boy in the same way that Claire is. I think it's really showing how much this hum and this group has warped their morals. They're all too focused on the transcendence that they've just experienced, how it felt to use that dormant 90% of their brains. Here, I also want to bring up this really weird part about Emily, the older woman in the room, which, by the way, I saw something about Emily Bronte recently, and it made me think back to the last time I filmed where I said that Emily is like a young person name, and I thought, oh my god, every comment I'm going to get is going to say, Emily is from the 1700s or whenever. Please don't correct me. Please don't correct me. I don't care. I don't care where the name Emily originated. I don't care when it originated. My sister is named Emily. So to me, that's a name for 20-year-olds, but I understand that it's a really old name, okay? It gives me personally the vibe of youth. Please don't let all the comments be about that. Anyway, what Claire says about Emily is this. I found myself wondering when Emily, buttoned up and pushing 70, might have last experienced an orgasm of any sort. I got the feeling there wasn't much happening in that department between her and Tom anymore, and somehow I struggled to picture her working magic with a suction dildo in the shower. Okay, insane. All of the weird ageism and perception of older women as sexless beings aside, I think it's so funny to act like younger women are universally and regularly jerking it with dildos. I'm sure some are. I don't mean to invalidate you. I just like don't think that's the universal experience. They're like it's called flicking the bean, right? Is this allowed? Please don't remove this video. There's something very interesting to me about the conception of women as only being able to get off with penetrative sex. And I'm sure someone who is more smarter and less scared of the YouTube overlords could explore that. Howard says that he and Joe have been tuning for years and they can get off like 8 times in an afternoon without touching themselves, but that he didn't want to share that with the group before they had established trust because doing exactly this at his old job is what got him fired from his tenured professorship. Accusations of inappropriate sexual misconduct and hypnotization of grad students for his own sexual gratification. After this like truly life-changing experience, Kyle and Claire have a moment together when they leave the meeting where they talk to each other candidly and openly for the first time in a while. As we know her to be in all interpersonal relationships except her marriage, Claire is childish and desperate and needy with Kyle. She's like, he doesn't text me as much anymore. Like, is he mad at me? He used to send me 100 texts a night, and now he only sends me 70. He is a 17-year-old boy. The two of them speak in this kind of annoying, faux intellectual, abstract way about the meeting and their evolving relationship with the hum, how they're both scared and excited, feeling like they're on the precipice of something great. They liken it to spending your whole life in one room, and then all of a sudden, the door opens, and they've just now stepped into a new room, and it's too dark and too big to even see the walls. And Kyle is like, I want to step into that room together. Because he is a 17-year-old boy, and that is how they fucking flirt. The characters being well written, particularly with their dialogue, makes it so much harder to read. Like, I want to scream. He leans in to kiss her. She leans away from him. He then says, I'm in love with you, but not like a girlfriend or a friend or a mom, but some other thing. And she says, Kyle, I'm in love with you too. He says, I want to tune with you. And she says that would be a betrayal of the group. But she's following him hand in hand down the street anyway. He takes her to this tent in the woods, all filled up with books and quilts and candles and shit. And it takes her an irritatingly long time to realize that the kid who has been kicked out of his home is living here. They then do it, but they don't do it. It's, oh, we didn't touch each other, so it's fine. But also, like, literally says the tent had the after smell of making love. So which is it? Is it fine or is it not fine? We all know what it is. Claire just doesn't. This experience is revelatory for them, but even still, Claire can't convince Kyle to come and stay with her at her huge empty house. She can't even make him come in to take a shower. I have omitted a lot of the details of his, like, seduction methods here because mainly they make me feel sick, and I'm sure you wouldn't want to hear me relay them to you. It's really nothing explicit or graphic, which makes it worse. Everything he does is like the pure, unearned confidence of the inexperienced teenage boy, and it's absolutely horrible, especially because rarely, if ever, does Claire take a step back as the adult and look at what's going on between her and her student. Even the Claire writing this, who is now separated from what happened in the tent, what happened between her and Kyle, doesn't look at it from any other perspective than a woman who is like in love. And she, more than anyone, should know what teenagers are like. She has a teenage child. She also has been a high school teacher for, I think, at least a decade. But seeing Kyle for what he really is, the child that he really is, would also force her to see herself as the predator that she is. You want to scream at the book as you're reading it. You hate her so much. And maybe too much. Similarly to Tampa by Alyssa Nutting, which is a kind of, but not really similar story, it kind of detracts from the nuances of this kind of story to make your lead a comically despicable character. But then at the same time, there's also something I find so enjoyable about really hating a narrator. Tampa is by far a better and more well-written book in my opinion, but comparing them, I do think that this one has a more complex main character in terms of her unlikability. She has a lot more going on with her than just simply being a predator, and I appreciate that. My thoughts really haven't changed all that much since we last spoke. I think I'm feeling more positive about the characterization and the voice now. I fully own up to being wrong before about the things I thought were surface level. I was the surface level one. I was missing the depth of them. It has slowed down a tiny little bit. It's got a little bit more repetitive than the first part of the book, but there's still a lot of momentum, and I am very intrigued to find out what happens in the last 80 pages, and I really hope it doesn't disappoint me. I will talk to you once I'm there and give you a more complete and rounded review and let you know what happens. I'll see you then. Bye. Okay, we're done. I have mixed feelings, but I think mostly positive. Let's just get into the rest of the plot. I need to get this over with. It is midnight. My bedtime is 10:30. The day after her and Kyle do this tuning thing together, she walks around the world a changed woman. She has this gratitude for life. She says it feels like the boundaries between her and the world are thinner. And at first, that's a beautiful thing. And then it's too much, and she starts getting overwhelmed and feeling like undefined and unmoored. She doesn't know where she ends and the world begins. And then she runs into Damien in the grocery store. She's shocked to learn that he has a partner and a child, and she realizes that he's kept a lot of himself from the group, who have tried to extract every personal detail from everyone in there. When he introduces her to his girlfriend, she understands immediately that this woman has no idea what the group is. Claire thinks that Damien hasn't even told her about the hum at all to protect her. He is a very paranoid, conspiratorial, right-wing man who has made it clear in the meetings that he believes that being hearers of this hum puts them all in danger. So, of course, he wouldn't risk his loved ones by exposing them to it. Claire feels a little bit better after chatting with Damien and getting to know him a little more, and then she gets home and her old friend from work at the school, Cass, shows up at her house. Cass was her closest friend before everything went down, and she hasn't heard anything from Cass since, which makes sense considering that she had one time come into the classroom with the door closed and seen Claire and Kyle pull apart from a hug. Cass is here to check in and kind of half apologize. She says she felt some instinct to come over, some old habit popped back up. And then she starts trying to proselytize, which of course enrages Claire, the diehard atheist, who starts ranting about how if she converted to Christianity, that would be another man, God, taking credit for her successes? I don't know. It didn't make any sense. I don't know if it was supposed to. Claire moves from being deeply offended to then realizing that her and Cass are actually kind of on the same wavelength, both being devoted believers to a cause. This, however, does not trigger any other revelations for Claire, or even really any further thought. While she's come to peace with this attempt at conversion, she also knows that her and Cass will never speak to each other again. So they finish their tea and she leads Cass to the door, where Cass asks Claire if what everyone is saying is true, if she is a predator. Claire is, of course, hugely offended, as anyone who believes they're not a child predator would be, but Cass says, I know that it's true, actually. She says, I once saw you two in your car laughing together at a stoplight near the school, and I could tell by your face, we're so close, we're such good friends. I knew, even before you did, that you were in love. Which does kind of bring me back to that thing that I talked about earlier, where I was understanding Claire, imagining the different impressions that Kyle would do of the people in the group as showing us that she was delusional, because he's like simply not a funny character. He's actually very serious and solemn. But this here did make me think that maybe I was being a little bit too generous with that. Maybe we are supposed to think that Kyle, who has not been shown to have a humorous bone in his body, would actually do these impressions of the group. I don't really know anymore. That night, Claire is kept awake by the motion detector lights going off in her backyard, and she knows that there is something out there beyond her perception that is coming for her. Of course, she's terrified, and she calls Joe, and Joe and Howard get up without a question, and they come to her, and they check out her yard, and they don't see any evidence that anyone has been back there, even an animal, but they let her spend the night at her house. Nothing else ever comes from this, but it is part of the creation of a narrative of who Joe and Howard are to Claire. The next day at the meeting, it gets really, really tense and heated, with Damien throwing his handgun down on the coffee table and ranting and raving about how they're all being targeted by the deep state. Everyone is being stalked. Mia's computer was hacked. Howard is trying to calm him down, but Damien won't hear any other explanations than what he already believes, which you might think sounds familiar. Finally, Howard says, put the gun away or get out, and Damien listens, but he says, I can't believe you would have kicked me out. And here, Howard stutters a little bit, and he goes, I wouldn't have, which kind of throws that hierarchy I was talking about earlier into a little bit of disarray. Damien still holds strong that they're all being stalked and targeted and they're in danger, and then there's a knock at the door. Perfect timing. This is Kyle's mom. She is here with Paul and Ashley. Kyle says, don't let her in. She'll mess with my head and she'll make me see doctors. And then he reveals that his mom did not kick him out. They got in a fight and he left. At 17 years old, he ran away. And she has been looking all over for him, like posting on Facebook, talking to all his friends, trying to find her kid. Claire furious that he's been lying, but he says, I had to. She was keeping me from you. Directly to Claire. Not even a plural you, not even the group. And none of the adults in the room think, that's weird. None of them think, maybe we should be keeping an eye on this. While Kyle's mom pounds at the door, desperately trying to get through to Kyle physically, but also emotionally with this little lecture that she's giving, Ashley calls Claire and begs her to send Kyle out and end this once and for all. The adults on the outside are going with a child kidnapping narrative, and Kyle doesn't want to interact with his mom at all to try and convince her otherwise. Not that anything he said would or even should convince her. Like, how much can Kyle really be here at this house of his own volition? Claire tries to explain to Ashley the transcendence of the tuning, and she says it's beyond anything that you could imagine. It's beyond orgasm. And that is all that Ashley hears, that this is a sex thing. Claire's trying to re-explain it to her, and she's saying over the phone, like, no, why are you crying? Which is just like so sad. Also, I love it when you learn something about the other person in a conversation because of the speaker's in dialogue reaction to what they're doing. That shit always gets me. It always succeeds for me no matter what emotion it's trying to evoke. Ashley says, Mom, if you love me, you need to walk out of that house. And Claire says, I can't. And then the next chapter starts and Claire is saying, I want to be clear that I never chose the group over Paul and Ashley. And it's like, you literally just did. Like, not even 3 sentences ago, you just did that. I love the juxtaposition when Claire butts in from the present with her thoughts that are meant to come across as like methodical and deliberate and almost objective, but are totally antithetical to whatever she's just described. She's pretending like she's one step removed and can look at it from someone with the knowledge of hindsight, but she's unable to see anything past her own viewpoint. Anyway, this situation becomes a police standoff. It's like a little bit overdramatic, but also not wholly unbelievable. The group doesn't want to talk to the police because when Howard tried to clear things up with the officer who knocked at the door, what he really said was, you can't come in without a warrant, and then the officer tried to come in anyway. They know that if Kyle leaves, he'll be taken away, and they will never let him near the group again. And the group just can't separate from each other, especially, of course, Kyle and Claire. So it escalates and escalates and escalates until there are news vans on the block and a live feed of what's going on. Nora, who is the mother of Kyle's friend, says that she can't do it. She breaks. She wants to go home. She wants to see her family. She doesn't want to be involved with the police or the news, and they fight her hard. Particularly Leslie, the real estate agent, if you remember, gets absolutely viciously nasty with her, where Joe is saying like, you're really gonna leave after everything we've been through? Almost everyone takes on very similar manipulation tactics to get her to stay, but it doesn't work. She tells them that she loves them, and then she moves toward the door to leave, and Leslie physically restrains her. And then everyone physically restrains her, except for Claire and Kyle and Sean. It becomes almost a brawl, but really it's just like 5 or 6 people trying to force this woman to the ground so that they can tune with her to calm her down without her permission. Nora is screaming and crying, and then she breaks free and she manages to get out the door, and they watch her on the newsfeed as she's swarmed by reporters asking her what's going on and who she is and whether Kyle is safe inside. The big question, though, is, are you in a sex cult? This gets everybody really worked up. They are shocked, having no idea where this came from, though Claire does. Claire knows that this was Ashley. Of course, part of why this is so shocking is because there is some element of truth to it that none of them would ever bear to face, that they have done a very careful job of reframing for themselves so that they never even have to consider a world in which this group is like that. To the point where Ashley was like openly telling her daughter about it and was shocked when she dared to understand it in a different way. The reporters all swarm her asking questions, and then the feed that they're watching pans over to their reporter who says, "This just in, an update on the Sequoia Crescent cult." That is so fucking cornball. That shit is so stupid. I'm sorry, as if the local news would have come up with this stupid name in the span of like an hour. That's not how any of this works, especially with something that has boundaries and a definition. The word cult means something. The news at this point knows literally nothing. They're not gonna go naming it like this, are they? Like, the local news is not a tabloid. Even if I'm wrong and this would happen in the real world, girl, It is so fucking corny. Come on. So the group wants to harness their power by tuning, of course, but Damien refuses to all sit together with their eyes closed while there's this huge police presence outside, so he puts his gun on the table. Howard tries to fight it, but Joe makes him let it go. They tune, but it takes some convincing to get Claire involved. She has been expressing this concern about tuning again. She's unsure if she'll be able to hold on to herself. She thinks she'll fall into the hum completely. We've talked in this video about how she feels like the boundaries between her and the world are thinner, like she's less defined. She brings that up often, ever since that second tuning with Kyle. And she was right. They tune and Claire loses herself. And by that I mean she loses her mind entirely. At first, it seems like almost like she's having a seizure, and then she starts ripping off her clothes. They're trying to calm her by like wrapping her up in blankets and giving her water and then dumping water on her, but she is just like screaming gibberish and stripping naked. So as you already know what will happen, she runs outside naked, screaming at the news cameras. But Howard and I think Joe, maybe Damien, I'm not sure, Howard and somebody drag her back into the house and they lock the door again. And she spends a while completely out of it and then starts coming to, rambling about how she became everything and everyone and how we're all just atoms. And she's like, what is this? And they're like, that's a coffee table. And she's like, no, but what is it really? One of her examples of who she became is Kyle's wife of 20 years, which isn't, that's interesting. That's telling. That's an example to give. She also says she was his shit in the toilet. She was everything, everywhere, all at once. I didn't love how this part was written because it was just kind of flavorless. It was very unclear how much Claire could understand of what was happening around her. It seems like it should be nothing, but we get the whole scene described to us from first person and not really from Claire's present day voice. I'm not a writer, I just critique writing, so I don't really know exactly how this could have been done better, but I have seen it be done better with this push and pull between the grounded in reality, physical truth of what's going on and the frightening, almost abstractly untethered interior of a mental break. As it is in the listeners, this is just kind of nothing. And I also think it's a little bit unclear, but not in a deliberate or interesting way, more like the author didn't necessarily know what he was going for or how to achieve it. Claire is still barely coherent, trying to explain what she experienced when the police knock down the door. Damien lunges for his gun, and when they see him raise it, they shoot him, and they hit both him and Kyle, and they drop to the floor. Damien is wounded, and from the ground, he fires into the police officer, and then all the other officers, of course, fire back, and they take him down, and Claire is holding Kyle, and he isn't moving. And the chapter ends, and we cut to this little vignette with the coyote sniffing around the spread out and destroyed remnants of Kyle's tent, which is the first time in the book that I really felt the impact of the author's history and experience as a playwright come in. Claire is not invited to either Kyle or Damien's funerals. The group dissolved at the first shot fired. She spent 3 weeks in the mental hospital afterwards, and Paul visited her every day, while Ashley visited not once. They did eventually find the source of the hum. All it took was a fatal shootout to get the ball rolling on that. It was a natural gas pipeline that had increased its pressure by 30% around the time that everyone started hearing it. And when they turn it back down, the hum stops, though not immediately for Claire. It quiets down over the next 2 weeks slowly until one morning it's completely gone. I know I said earlier I thought it would be really disappointing if it gave us a source for the hum. I don't think this is something like crazy interesting and unique. Like it is banal. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not banal. You are trying to embarrass me on the internet. I'm just not going to make an attempt at that word, actually. The things this book wants you to think about are not where's the hum coming from. There's a lot more that takes precedence over that. If it was a mystery, I would hate this as the conclusion to that mystery. But as it is, I like the mundanity of this, of how this like tiny little thing that they could just turn off just destroys so many lives. And I also like that there is an answer and that Claire doesn't accept that answer. She gets to take her life back while also having just enough evidence to refuse to believe that it actually was the pipeline. She's like smiling at neighbors and going for jogs and cooking herself meals and healing her relationship with Paul again, but Claire cannot admit that she was wrong. She is virtually just as indoctrinated as she was before. She's just no longer sleep deprived and affected by it every waking moment. So she has the capacity to be a human again, even while holding these illogical beliefs. The very end of the narrative has Paul moving back in with her and her having one last confrontation with Ashley, who both wants to argue and to hear her mom say that the pipeline was the source of the hum, but also is hugely understanding that her mom was so incredibly sick. Instead of just like totally focusing on how profoundly Claire has failed her and ruined her life, which she is angry about, she also offers some understanding and compassion towards her. And it's like really complex for her. Like she doesn't really feel a right to feel that anger because she knows that her mom was sick. But Claire won't say, yes, I was sick, or no, the hum was not real, or I did something wrong, or I failed you. They do hug, though, at the end of this conversation, and it seems like there is room for healing in their relationship. And then Ashley leaves, and Claire walks up the stairs, and she stops dead in her tracks when she realizes that somewhere, faintly, she can still hear the hum. There's then a postscript about how she doesn't want to discredit the victims of Howard's that have come forward since this all went down, but that she did want to tell her truth and that this was her truth. And she says that her depiction of Howard and Joe in this story could also be seen as evidence of how deeply their manipulation worked on her, but that she still can't see it like that. And that is The Listeners by Jordan Tannehill, a book about agency and truth and indoctrination and right and wrong. I think this was a pretty ambitious book, and it managed, I believe at least, to deliver on most of what it set out to do, while also having its issues. Like most books have. This definitely, I think, sits at a strong 4 for me. There is a lot here, and I think through this video, I have already said a lot of what I want to say. I think this book asks its readers a lot of questions, and I really appreciate the skill that it takes to do that. I never felt like this was holding my hand and leading me to believe one thing or another. It wanted me to question these things for myself. Especially, a lot of these things are like more between the lines. It's not just the really obvious things like the facts of the situations, like with Kyle and Claire's relationship, that it's asking you to think about and form your opinions on. I also thought thematically it was really strong. Of course, there was some flatness, but there was also nuance and depth, and it definitely leaned toward the latter most of the time. I've praised the characterization, and I think now that it's less that the characters or their characterization is really well done, I actually found it to often be pretty inconsistent. It's more that their dialogue is extremely well written and their reactions to things have depth and are believable. This is a very dialogue heavy book, which makes sense for a book so focused on interpersonal relationships, and I think that is where Tannehill's experience as a playwright is a huge benefit. Sometimes you read books by playwrights and you can just tell without even reading the author bio, and I do not mean that in a good way. The way they treat space and descriptions is both overwrought and too sparse. There's like so much left to be filled in by actors and set designers. It's either not enough or way too much, and often it's both. I didn't really find that with this book at all until that little scene with the fox that was like so writing for visuals. I thought the history of the author being a playwright added a really nice flow to the dialogue and an understanding of how people communicate and how they understand each other that I really liked. Generally, I thought the writing was just okay. It certainly didn't stand out to me on the sentence level, either positively or negatively. I thought it was mostly fine and inoffensive, but in the beginning especially, there was a very distracting, both under and overuse of commas. If you have really strong feelings about commas or like an Oxford comma, either way, this book will piss you off. I said this was a nitpick earlier with the timeline not matching up, but I think I was right to nitpick on that because the timeline never makes sense in this book. I feel like he kind of just threw random lengths of time in there and then never went back to like reference them and make sure that it made sense later on. There's also no sense of the scale of time whatsoever, which does feel important. Sometimes it feels like she's describing every single day to us, and then sometimes it feels like it goes weeks without anything, but it doesn't always tell us when we're skipping time, but then it also tells us way too clearly at other parts. And then there's like time in the grand scheme of things too. I thought that this aged itself brutally at many points for reasons completely unknown to me. Like, why are we talking about her Conkin backpack? What was with the Kevin Spacey reference? What do you mean we're listening to Old Town Road? So many times in here, for some godforsaken reason, she tells her Google Home a really specific instruction that was just like so ridiculously unnecessary, it almost made me laugh. Like she'll literally be like, Google, turn volume up by 2. What is happening? What do you mean? The setting generally was not very strong. This is, I believe, a Canadian man who currently lives in London writing a book set in some undefined, generally American town. There's randomly sometimes these little Britishisms, but then it uses American spelling most of the time, but then sometimes Canadian or British spelling. At one point, Kyle says in grade 11, which is just like purely simply Canadian. I know what you are. Overall, I thought this was fast-paced and enjoyable and insightful. I think it's a great book for like any moment. That doesn't really make any sense. What I mean is that I think you can choose how much effort you want to put in, how much you want to give this book. Like I said, it's fast-paced. It is simple writing. It's very easy to read, but also there is a lot to think about that you can think about if you want to, but you don't have to. It's not hiding anything from you. There's nothing that you need to like discover in the writing, but there is general questions about humans that if you want to think about, you can. And I like that. I really appreciated that. I think this, you could read this at any time and you would always enjoy it the same amount, you know? Some books, you need to read at a specific time, not this one. This will always come to you at the right time in your life. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm going with. Sometimes it was a little bit weird. That could be both in a good way or a bad way, but it was just a little bit weird, as all pretty good things tend to be. That's all I have to say. Bye.